Good afternoon to our participants. And welcome to this event today, which commemorates the 25th of May, which is celebrated worldwide as the Africa Day, and as a commemoration of the founding of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. We've came together as different organizations and institutions, the Wits School of Governance, Wits Business School, and Africa and African Diaspora, to create a platform where we have conversations as Africans on the futures of the African continent, including looking at the current challenges that the continent faces in the era of COVID-19 pandemic. The purpose of today's conference or webinar is to allow different voices to exchange views, to provide insights across different thematic areas on governance, on African debt crisis, as well as institution building and building resilience for African economies. The brainchild of this event is Professor Reverend Frank Chikane and Professor Maurice Khadebe, who is head of Wits Business School. He unfortunately couldn't be with us today, so I'm standing in essence, for both schools, the Wits Business School and the Wits School of Governance. We're really looking forward to robust exchanges of views between the panelists, but also reflections from the audience on the chat line. I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is going to sketch for us the theme of this event, its origins, and where it is going. Many of you would know Reverend Chikane for his role as an anti-apartheid activist, including as a leader in the South African Council of Churches, where he was for many years the Secretary General. Post-apartheid, he served in the administrations of Presidents Thabo Mbeki and Kgalema Motlanthe. He has since served on many capacities as a community leader, civic leader, as an elder in the church movement, and serves on many boards to provide wisdom, insights, counsel, mentorship. And we're very fortunate to have Reverend Chikane as one of our visiting professors at Wits School of Governance. Over to you, Professor Chikane.
Thank you very much. And good morning to those who are in the Western Hemisphere, and good afternoon to those who are on the Eastern Hemisphere. My task is simple. It's to put this webinar within the context of the Africa and African Diaspora Conference we are planning for October this year. And so this webinar really, it's in preparation for that conference. And I would like to thank the partners we are working together with, the Wits School of Government and Business, and AAD, which is what I represent, and the ULP, which is the Unleashing Leadership Potential. We are doing this webinar in two parts. Today, it's really part one, and we're going to be focusing on the impact of the coronavirus on Africans on the African continent. Next time, on the 9th of June, we will be going global to go and focus on all the other regions where people of African descent find themselves. And so we'll have speakers from Brazil, the Caribbean, North America, etc. And so today is the beginning of a journey we are walking together. I would like just to say, for the people of African descent globally, the issue about the enslavement of Africans is critical. And I've picked up a map that just shows how Africans were taken over into Brazil, into the United States, into the Caribbeans. And they've been there for ages. And what we are doing is to bring together this family of all the people who were affected, including those who are on the African continent. Would like to emphasize that actually during this process, you had a triangular action where slaves were taken from Africa to be enslaved to produce raw material, sent to Europe, and then we received manufactured goods. And because of that, Africa was impoverished over a long time, and people of African descent were also impoverished over a long time. So since the beginning of the last century, and after the abolishment of slavery, Pan-Africanism became the theme between those who are in the diaspora and those who are on the African continent. And I would like to say that the conference we are organizing is based on all the Pan-African conferences from 1900 up to date. The critical ones are the one in Paris, where they met after World War II, and hoping that the victors, those who defeated others, who won the war, would listen to them because they participated in that war, so thinking it's in defense of the freedoms of people in the world. And they were not listened to. In 1948-45, we had also a conference, Manchester Conference, where they talked about the Second World War and expected that as the United Nations was formed, people of African descent would be free. That was not to be. And so we are meeting in October this year to reflect on the discussions at Manchester, which gave birth to the independence of many countries on the African continent, and also in the Caribbean. And I just want to say it in short, that the African Union has already incorporated people in the diaspora as the 6th region of the African Union, and it is legislated in terms of the Constitutive Act of the African Union. This conference in October we are preparing for will bring together people of African descent from Asia, Caribbean, Europe, Latin America, North America, Oceania, and also the African continent. And we have got a concept paper that is in our website, which tells you exactly the details of what we will be doing at that particular conference. And I would like to say that this conference is not going to be an ordinary conference, because a conference, you go there, read papers, write books, go home. This is a conference where we're going to determine a program of action to free people of African descent, change their conditions of life, and make sure that they compete and perform at the highest level competitively in terms of research, in terms of contribution to society, in terms of the economy. We bring him together the regions to reflect in preparation for this conference. We're also doing issue-based consultative conferences, like for instance on reparation, like we are doing today on the impact of the coronavirus on people of African descent. We're bringing in the United Nations, we are bringing in the AU, we're bringing in CARICOM to be part of this conference. So in short, I just want to say that what we are doing today is to focus on a particular theme, which is going to contribute in the discussions at the conference. And I wish all of you the best in reflecting on this theme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof Chikane. It's very rare that we get together as Africans and also as African people in other regions. Even our trading patterns are hubs and spoke. It's easier for us. We find it easier to trade with Europe, to trade with America, to trade with China, rather than trading amongst ourselves. And also the exchange of ideas is something that is still a rarity in the continent, where we come together. We have a shared platform to provide insights about the future of the continent. And today's session will focus on COVID-19, its impact on the continent, as well as the kind of solutions that are required to take us out of this conundrum. Before I call on the next speaker, I would like to introduce all the panelists and then call them individually to share their insights. We have on the speakers list Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, who is the Director for Africa and West Asia at International IDEA. He will soon be joining us at the Wits School of Governance, so we're very fortunate to have him. He has more than 35 years of experience in areas of international relations, governance, and human rights, both as an academic and as a civic leader participating in intergovernmental institutions. He has in the past participated as a member in the African Union Assessment Panel and chair of the boards of several think tanks, including the ECPDM based in Europe, as well as Open Society Initiative for West Africa. We also have a practitioner, Ms. Rose Maruru, who is co-founder and CEO of EPIC Africa, which is a Senegal-based non-profit startup that is filling a very critical data and capacity gap in the philanthropy market. She's also just recently participated in a study on the role of philanthropy in Africa's development, and we look forward to gain insights from her experience on the ground. We also have Professor Eddie Maluka, who is CEO of the African Peer Review Mechanism, which is his current position. He, until recently, was also the president of convocation at the University of Cape Town. He is visiting professor at the Wits School of Governance and has previously fulfilled several roles as a civil servant, including as a special advisor to the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa. We also have as a speaker, I think, George Kararach, Professor George Kararach, who is a lead economist for the African Development Bank, based here in South Africa, but looking at the region. He is also a visiting professor at the Wits School of Governance at Wits, and a non-resident fellow at the Payne Institute, Colorado School of Mines. He has previously played a leading role as a senior economist for the UN Economic Commission for Africa. I'm going to call, I'm not sure if he has joined us yet, Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, to give us his remarks on overcoming socio-economic challenges, building capabilities, and consolidating democratic reforms in time of COVID-19. Over to you, Bayo.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and I'm delighted to be part of this program. Thank you for putting it together. And whilst we are still at it, let me join in wishing all Africans, participants in this conversation, a very happy Africa Day. I think it's evident in many respects that perhaps the biggest challenge which confronts us on the African continent today is how to turn the table of underdevelopment, particularly manifested in terms of social and economic challenges which confront us across the continent. Easily, I would say that this is an issue on which there is a wide consensus amongst analysts and policymakers, although that is probably where the consensus ends, insofar as there's really not much agreement on what to do effectively about tackling these challenges, these social and economic challenges. I note that in the context of the transition post-apartheid from the OAU to the AU, one of the major rallying calls was for the continent, having won the battle for political liberation, as it were, and ended colonialism, at least on much of the mainland of the continent, especially colonialism from Europe on the continent. It seems that we agreed that a renaissance on the continent would have to be built around what some have called the second liberation of economic dependence, overcoming economic dependence, and also the social dislocations that have been manifest in the period since the putative year of independence in 1960. And we've seen several initiatives which have been taken on a continental scale, but also at the national level. Continentally, I think many of us celebrated the launching of the African Union on the basis of a new structure, which particularly enabled a specific set of departments to be devoted to social and economic questions. The Department of Social Affairs, to which humanitarian has not been added of recent, but also the Department of Economic Affairs before the reconfiguration led by the Kagame panel, and the Department of Trade and Industry, mainly to speak to the important need for the African continent to change the structure of both its domestic economy, but also its relationship with the rest of the world, in particular its place in the global division of labor. We also saw the launching of NEPAD, the new Partnership for Africa's Development, which represented Africa's own self-definition of the way in which it sought to benefit from globalization. Unfortunately, I think most of the initiatives which were taken, whether at the national level, where national planning processes were revamped, or at the continental level, through the initiatives I just referred to, did not seem to make the kind of dent that I think most of us would want or would have wanted to see on the socioeconomic challenges confronting our continent and its constituent countries. And I guess this is probably one of the reasons why during the time of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma as chairperson of the African Union Commission, a rethinking of our overall approach was launched that culminated in the introduction of Agenda 2063 and its key pillars, which includes an emphasis, I think remarkable, maybe even radical from the point of view of the continental organization, the introduction of the word transformation and a commitment to a transformative project on our continent as a goal to which all countries should subscribe. I guess that agenda is still being unfolded. It's within its first decade. But to the extent to which Agenda 2063 would succeed, I think it would also depend on the kinds of policies which are taken at the national level, the effectiveness with which efforts are made at the domestic level in different countries, not only to embrace and operationalize the idea of transformation, but also, I would say, to relaunch a new bargain between state and society in a way that will enable citizens to enjoy the fullness of their citizenship. I would say that on the basis of some of the evidence which we have before us, we've not done really terribly too well. In the first decade of this millennium, on the back of a commodity boom, there was much talk about Africa rising, lions on the move, or tigers, and various metaphors that were deployed to describe the burst of growth, sometimes hovering around 6-7%, which we saw, and even reference to the fact that 6 out of 10 fastest growing economies in the first decade of the millennium around the world were specifically Africa. And I say that this was not really itself something to celebrate, because it was a specifically commodity-dependent boom in growth. And I'm sure George might elaborate a bit more on some of this, since it's his bread and butter. But more specifically, it did not generate the kinds of impact on employment, poverty, and inequality, which might even have been expected, in addition to an overall expansion in the productive base of our economies. With the consequence, I think that across the region, without exception, almost every country is confronted with a severe problem of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, but not limited to that. And I'm not even going to talk about underemployment. And at the same time, the boundaries of poverty and inequality have also been expanding fairly rapidly, almost to a point where, at least in some countries, it has reached a state of not being sustainable, if not socially, then certainly politically. And in the context of the outbreak of the pandemic, I think we began to see not only a manifestation of this unsustainability, but also a glimpse into some of the serious contradictions that we might have to deal with in the years ahead, in the next few years. At one level, of course, the pandemic came on the back of what was already a slowing of growth in many countries. Even in a number of cases, countries on the verge of a return to crisis, some into recession, and trying to get themselves out of recession, some dealing with balance of payments problems, underpinned by a heavy debt servicing obligation, and so on and so forth. And what essentially the pandemic did was to feed into this context of a crisis that was already snowballing to effectively lead us into some of the quite difficult consequences which the management of the pandemic has taken, particularly on the working poor. Governments were certainly not sufficiently equipped in terms of the resources at their disposal in a vast majority of cases to respond effectively to the pandemic. And in some instances had to actually depend on donor support to begin to be able to effectively implement lockdown measures in order to contain the spread of the pandemic on the continent. But for the working poor, lockdown was a very expensive option, I think, in practically every country of the continent. For those who eke out a living on a daily basis, a day lost not being able to eke out that living essentially meant an inability to put food on the table in a context where, again, as I said, for a majority of countries, governments were unable to provide the palliatives that could soften the impact of the pandemic on them. So effectively, within the first few months of the pandemic, from a shock response, which produced some compliance, waiting to see and understand what the full weight of the pandemic would be, we began to see a universal violation of the restrictions, forcing encounters of a violent nature between policing authorities trying to enforce lockdown measures and the working poor insisting that they needed to go out to eke out a living. And in some of the countries of the continent, we also witnessed mass demonstrations in which basically protesters were putting forward the idea that the choice before them was between death and death from the pandemic or death from hunger. And it was probably preferable to die from the pandemic than to die from hunger. And it has to be a certain level of desperation, I think, that leads citizens to present the choices that they confront in such stark and sometimes even tragic terms. And all of this, in my view, as I wind up, Chair, point to the important need for us as a continent to begin to pay attention first and foremost to rebuilding the essence of the state-society bargain. And the pandemic has helped us to put this in sharper relief, if there was any doubt whatsoever, that the relationship of trust and the reciprocal bargain between citizens and government broke down, and in some cases broke down irretrievably. I think the pandemic brought this out and helps us to see the kinds of measures that need to be taken in order to properly rebuild the foundations of that relationship. And in the absence of an effective state-society bargain, we are not likely, I think, to be able to put in place the kinds of governance, at least of a democratic nature, that will be based on the consent of citizens and also the exercise of choice by citizens through the electoral process. You would not be surprised that in a place like Mali, which is back in the headlines again, the president, former President Keita, called an election in order to answer some of the criticisms about his management of the pandemic, amongst other things, won that election and was promptly overthrown within months of winning that election, as hundreds of thousands of his compatriots took to the streets to demand his departure because of the ineffectiveness of the government to respond to the basic livelihood concerns of citizens. And I fear that this may in fact be the narrative that we might see in parts of the continent in the years ahead if urgent measures are not taken to rebuild social policy, and not simply social protection, not simply handouts, but universal social policy of the kind which does not produce stigma and which allows for every citizen as a matter of right to be able to enjoy a basket of rights regardless of their station in life, as a clear indication of their membership of a political community, namely the country. If time permits, I would like to come back to elaborate a bit more on this, but I would say that on the back of existing fractures in economy and society before the pandemic, we have witnessed over the last 1.5 years a further exposure, even in some cases, the rawness of those fractures in a way, I think, that challenges us to address our minds much more directly and in a purposeful manner to finding solutions that will enable legitimate governance and stability to reign on our continent. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Bayo. That was lovely. Very comprehensive set of propositions there, both critical, but also concrete in suggesting what needs to be done. Made some very strong points there about the need to rethink the social compact, the social policy, strengthen the sinews of trust between government and society, and how we what it would take to repair this. And on that note, I would like to call upon Ms. Rose Mururu to to give us some of the reflections from civil society. What has been the experience on the trust from the ground, on the trust between society and government? How has civil society fared in the wake of this pandemic, and what would it take to strengthen Africa's capacity to rebuild social structures post-COVID-19?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. So I'm going to talk about or base my presentation on a survey that we carried out last year between April 29th and May 15th on the impact of COVID-19 on civil society organizations across the continent. Now, our survey took place roughly 2 months following the declaration of COVID-19 as a global pandemic and the subsequent wide-ranging restrictive measures that governments across the continent introduced in a bid to control the disease. Now, what motivated us to carry out the survey? Well, we were concerned that civil society actors were being left out of the national COVID-19 responses. The images that were coming through television, radio, and other media were overwhelmingly of government and the business sector responding to the pandemic. So we saw, pictures and images of business leaders donating food, medicine, and money to national government efforts. We heard about government concerns for the economy, of special funds and other measures to safeguard small and medium-sized businesses. But we saw and heard very little about the involvement of civil society in this response. And yet, we knew, based on past experience, that there would not be an effective response to the crisis without the involvement of civil society broadly defined. We also, of course, worried about the likely devastation that the pandemic would have on the already fragile civil society ecosystem and wanted to get a sense of what was actually going on. So in early April of 2020, EPIC Africa, together with some other partners, including at African NGOs, Safe Source in Uganda, Voluculture in Kenya, and Wati, a Senegal-based citizen think tank, hosted a Twitter chat with about 60 civil society groups and 3 of their funders. Now, this group expressed several concerns, and among these concerns was that the pandemic was not a medical emergency alone, but rather it was also a social and economic issue requiring interventions that civil society is good at. Concerns were also raised about ensuring that people's basic human rights were respected as governments sought to contain the spread of the disease through curfews and other measures. There had been reports, in fact, of violent enforcement of curfews, and questions were rising about whether the emergency relief programs underway in many countries would actually reach their intended beneficiaries. And so this conversation then prompted us to undertake our first survey, to get a little bit more, a better picture of actually what was happening to civil society organizations as well as the communities that they served. So at that time, there was hardly any data on the impact of COVID-19 on African civil society organizations specifically. The only 2 surveys that we could find in the public domain were global, with just a few African groups represented. So our survey sought to answer 5 questions. And the first one was, what was the immediate impact of the pandemic on the sector? The second question was, how are civil society organizations coping with the disruptions wrought by COVID-19? And our third question was, what was the outlook for civil society organizations in the medium term? And here we defined the medium term as the next 3 to 6 months. At the time of our survey, there was a prevailing expectation that COVID-19 would soon be over. So in fact, 6 months seemed like actually a rather far off horizon. We also wanted to know whether civil society organizations had initiated new activities in response to COVID-19, and if so, what these activities were and how they were being funded. And finally, we wanted to see what insights were emerging as civil society organizations grappled with the crisis and what these insights could mean in terms of the recovery and the rebuilding of the sector. So what were the findings? Well, the key finding was that the overall impact had been really swift It was widespread and it was very destabilizing for most organizations. So in fact, 98% of the 1,015 organizations from 44 countries that responded to our survey reported having been affected in one or more ways. Everything from losing funding to having to close down their programs. 84% indicated that they were not prepared to cope with the disruption at all. 70% had already reduced or canceled operations, and 56% said that they had already experienced a loss of funding. So how are all these organizations coping? Well, it was remarkable because they were very quick to respond, with many pivoting to working from home, for example, and cutting costs. But the solutions that organizations had adopted were not without their challenges. So for example, many reported that their staff lacked the tools to work from home, while others found that home was not a conducive work environment. Also, not all the work that they do lends itself to working from home. Although still early in the crisis, the expectation was that COVID-19 would soon be over, but it was already dawning on civil society organizations that there would not be a return to normal. Something seemed to have fundamentally changed. Now, in terms of financial outlook for the sector, it was rather grim, with 66% expecting that the loss of funding would continue. There was also an expectation that demand for services that they provide would rise along with costs. Yet, we found that only 34% of organizations reported having any reserves. In fact, and perhaps most concerning, was that close to 80% of the respondents felt that COVID-19 would have a devastating impact on the sustainability of many organizations. Despite this dire outlook, civil society organizations were actively involved in national and sometimes even continent-wide responses to the pandemic. Close to 85% of respondents reported having introduced new program activities specifically addressing COVID-19. How were these activities being funded? Interestingly, majority of these activities, about 70%, were self-funded. The rest of the funding came from a range of sources. Most notably, the leading sources of new funding were local, primarily individual donors and the private sector. Despite the involvement in the response to COVID-19, upward of 70% of the respondents felt that governments had failed to recognize and utilize their skills, their experience, and their networks. In fact, civil society organizations felt that this oversight was weakening the planning, the coordination, and the implementation of national responses, especially as the social, the cultural, and economic dimensions of the pandemic started to become visible. While many African organizations were overwhelmed by the immediate impact of COVID-19 on their operations, and some were already struggling to survive, there was surprising optimism about the future. In fact, we had about 45% saying that the pandemic would give rise to a more robust and agile sector. This optimism was not completely unfounded. The ways in which organizations were already adapting to the new normal indicated that the crisis could perhaps be the inflection point that would begin to reshape the sector towards more resilient, effective, and sustainable organizations. Now, let me highlight just 5 sort of shifts that we saw beginning to occur, even at this early stage, and that we thought perhaps offered or continued to offer civil society organizations with opportunities to build on. And the first shift was the reorientation of operations. As I said, civil society organizations had quickly found new ways of operating, demonstrating that they could be agile, they could be creative, they could be nimble. The second shift was, of course, the digital transformation. The crisis had catapulted civil society organization into the digital age. And of course, the pros and cons of that, which I wouldn't get into. A third shift was in the power relations between African civil society organizations and their funders. And we saw for the first time some funders ceding decision-making power to their quote-unquote local partners, allowing them to decide how to best use existing grants. And this is a trend that we hope will take root. The fourth shift was in the sector's solidarity. it seemed that the crisis had spawned greater collaboration and partnerships among organizations. They seem to be rising above the fragmentation that we so often see, and that tremendously weakens the sector. The fifth and kind of final shift was in the sector's image. So by quickly turning to COVID-related activities, including, of course, calling out human rights abuses and holding governments accountable, civil society organizations were demonstrating their relevance. And we hope that this would begin to reinforce their credibility with those they serve. Now, to conclude, as I said at the beginning, our research took place very early in the pandemic. The disease was still spreading, and its implications, not just for civil society, were evolving. But ultimately, we expected that the impact would be long-lasting, because although COVID-19 brought its own peculiar challenges, African civil society organizations were particularly vulnerable because of historical and ongoing conditions that have long characterized the sector. And one of those pre-existing conditions, of course, is a lack of data and knowledge about the sector. Despite the crucial role that civil society plays, the impact of many of these organizations is largely invisible to those who could be allies and supporters, including we Africans, on the continent and elsewhere. In fact, many Africans do not know that the freedoms we enjoy today were fought for and won through civic action. So surveys like the one that we did, and another one that we're planning to do as a follow-up, are filling critical gaps in evidence and knowledge about the sector. So a year on, or a little more than a year on since our last survey, we feel that it's important to assess again to see how the sector has fared and to what extent the optimism expressed a year ago has translated into action. So we're planning to launch a second survey at the beginning of June. And that upcoming survey and others, including the last one, are part of what Epic Africa and others are trying to do to really build knowledge about the sector. And it's really building blocks towards our broader vision of a vibrant civil society and philanthropic ecosystem on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rose Mururu. Those were very insightful remarks. Oftentimes, we think of governance as something that is about government, the government apparatus, and we forget that the governance really is at the nexus of the state, market, and society, and it is action in the civic space that generate momentum for democratic shifts, and also shifts in the ways in which corporates think about their services, in the ways in which donors, funders think about public value. So that's really very helpful. And I want to call upon Professor Eddie Maluka to reflect on this idea of governance, how governance has been reconstituted by the pandemic, our understanding of governance, how governance structures in the continent have been affected, and what does governance look like post-COVID-19? Over to you, Prof. Maluka.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, my brother, Professor, and also Professor Mzukisi Qobo, and also let me also take this opportunity to recognize Reverend Chikane and to say that we continue to receive prayers from him. We know wherever he's serving, he's praying for our country and wishing our country very well and our continent. And I'm very impressed by this initiative, and we'll do our best, of course, to support it. And the fellow panelists, my brother Bayo, and of course our sister who's just spoken very, very eloquently, our sister Rose. I'll be very quick, Mr. Chairman, because the guidelines you gave us, you advised the speakers to stick to a seven-minute guideline. I'll just talk about quickly because where I work at the African Peer Review Mechanism, and we we have this mandate given to us by our countries to assist them with improving governance on the continent. You know, the APRM has its own history. I won't go into that. And when this thing happened, when the COVID hit us, of course, here in Africa, it reached us at the beginning of last year. We, as the APRM, we responded in 5 ways. And then I'll just talk quickly about that, and then make some suggestions, and then perhaps also try to venture into the post-normal, the elements of the future. The first one, of course, what we did is that we conducted a continent-wide preliminary study on governance, impact of COVID-19 on the governance on the continent, and that study is now available. It can be assessed, and I'll come to some elements of its conclusions. And then we also, as part of that, establish a continental task force on COVID-19 and governance, which we still have now, because we have national offices. So we pulled together some of our national offices across the 5 regions. We didn't take all of them, just a few, and constituted them into this task force that was more like a reference group for the study and other initiatives we were undertaking relating to COVID-19. And then the third thing we did, of course, which from our core business point of view, was to review our tools, to review our methodology, to review our work. And the logic here there was that APRM were conducting all these reviews, but none of our reviews had foreseen this pandemic. So it's something we had to go back to the drawing board and say, what is missing in our methodology? And then we then said that because our methodology is anchored around 4 thematic areas: political governance and democracy, economic governance, you could say, and then the socio-development issues around poverty and all of that. And the 4th one around corporate governance, which is really the governance of the private sector. You talk up the market, you come from a business school background, Prof Mzukisi. So we then said, what is missing in our methodology? Why our methodology? Why, even though we always pride ourselves that the APRM has this early warning potential, why didn't we foresee this one? Then we realized that we don't look at state resilience of states to shocks, to crises, and so on. And there's quite a lot of work there, of course, has been done from the UN level, United Nations, another continental level. So we did a lot of work there. We reached out to continental and also the bodies dealing with issues of resilience, and the UN itself, the UN here, and the WHO. And at the level of the African Union, there is also a capacity there. So we have been working with them. And remember, when you talk about state resilience, which is also there, state resilience is not about the physical strength of states. It's about the elasticity of state institutions or of governance institutions in society, or the governance, the totality of the governance architecture in the elasticity. So if something is smaller, you must be able to shrink. If something is bigger, you must be able to expand. So you need elasticity, not physical strength, because physical strength is not what state resilience is all about. State resilience is about elasticity, inbuilt elasticity within the governance. So we have really reviewed that. We have introduced a 5th thematic area dealing with state resilience. We have defined a tool there. We have even deployed it. I'll come back to elements of it. The 4th thing we did was, of course, to deploy our reviews, the teams on the ground. We have traditionally looked at governance around the 4 thematic areas, but we were then requested by our leaders, our heads, that we need to find introduce new products, if I can use private sector language, that are quicker and so on. So we introduced what we call the targeted reviews. It's more like the thematic reviews. So we immediately then, after we now developed this tool on state resilience, we immediately deployed a review, a targeted review, looking at the state resilience and public health capabilities. We did that in Sierra Leone. The report is already out. It has just gone to the reviews. Now we'll be going back to Sierra Leone now to work with them in the implementation of the recommendation. And a number of countries now are requesting us to deploy the targeted review to look at their public health, the state resilience, and so on. And our tool we can share with you later during the discussion. Then the 5th response on our side, of course, we were given the mandate by the African Union
Assembly to track. It was under the reforms led by President Kagame to track the governance trends and dynamics on the continent. So we developed a tool to do that with the African Governance Report. So we did the first one 3 years ago. Now we work on the second one, and the second one was looking at African futures, governance futures. So we designed 4 futures, and that document, study, it's actually we used the future scenarios, the focus groups, and all of that. It was a continent-wide exercise involving experts, governments, our national offices, AU organs, and so on. So this will soon go to the Assembly. Unfortunately, the Assembly could not meet properly this year, except for the election of the new commission. So it has been deferred, but I don't want to talk about it a lot because it must still be presented. But that exercise really came up with 4 scenarios for governance in the future, and has made some suggestions, which then some of it will be discussed in detail at the right time. But what are the key elements? What are the key conclusions that come out from this different kind of works that we're doing? The first one is that really with COVID, and it goes back to what Prof Chikane was saying, Bio, and of course our dear sister Rose, that no single country can on its own defeat or confront this pandemic, because by definition, a pandemic is beyond borders. It's devastating. It's beyond your capacity to cope with the normal. And it is really forcing us as the African continent to go back to what Kwame Nkrumah said and advised us to do 60 years ago, when he said to us, instead of when we get independence, we created this nation state, some small, some big. And so we should have gone the Union of Africa, the United States of Africa, who created this federation, this big federation, to be able to harness and to master the resources of Africa across the continent, to be able to deploy them for the benefit of our continent, industrialization and all of that. And we invested rather in the nation states, in borders and sovereignty. And partly because of that, we lost the last 60 years. And this pandemic is really taking us to the drawing board to really help us rethink and to rethink the nation state, and also to rethink the limits of the nation state as a platform from which you could deal with global and continental challenges, but rather to see that there is more opportunities around collaboration, partnership, and of course, the great ideas of solidarity and Pan-Africanism. And I think it's something that we really need to pay more attention into. And this pandemic for me is just the beginning. We need Africa, for example, we need now to realize out of this pandemic that we should defeat and eradicate malaria on the continent, because other regions have done so. Already in the 1960s, the Americans were eradicating malaria in Panama. And in Asia, malaria, some countries have already eradicated it. Yet in Africa, we can't. So out of this pandemic, we really need to look at how do we use this experience to build a very much stronger Pan-African, you could say, continent-wide capability to be able to deal with pandemics. And I think it's something that we are not yet doing much work onto it, and it's something we need to look more. We have got the CDC there, and they are doing a little bit but they are responding, they are doing their best. But we need to really pose this pandemic to really say the pandemic is there, and it will probably come another 100 years. There will be another disaster of a comparable scale. But something that is immediate, that is there, that we must do, is to eradicate the malaria. The technology is there, and all these things are there, and even the scientific advances we have them, some of them in our institutions, research institutions on the continent. So we should try to use this experience to eradicate malaria on our continent. And then, of course, this pandemic, they tested the capability and the capacity of our governance institutions. And remember, as you said, Prof Mzu, that the pandemic is not necessarily a crisis or per se. It becomes a crisis because our own institutions are not prepared and unable to cope with it. And it's something that we has come out very strong in the studies, that none of our governments were prepared and ready for this. And then the regulatory environment. We have the global codes and standards, the Fendai framework, and which have been, of course, customized at the regional level. Some countries have developed national legislation based on this Fendai framework. Others haven't. And even within governments, I know in the case of South Africa, and we said a little bit about it, it was not even clear which legislation to use the Disaster Management Act, or do you treat this as a national state of emergency? So some of these, the regulatory issues within states, it's an issue even at the continent, because the continental level, we just set codes and standards and the model laws if necessary, but we don't even have a model law. In this case, we have the Sendai framework that countries now domesticate through some legislation. And then, of course, the issue around public awareness and public education. You know, in Japan, because of these, their vulnerability to certain disasters of nature in particular, they have incorporated these disasters into their public education system. I know sitting here, I've been through apartheid education, but I'm not sure how many and this is something that comes, how many of our countries have in their own public education system integrated issues of disaster management, disaster response. Within offices, you have the emergency assembly points, you have the alarm, you have the fire alert system and so on. So you need something like that nationwide across the country, but it has to start with the consciousness, alertness of people, for people to undergo, you have some exercises and so on, and education, and you have to have your media involved. So we don't have that public awareness and public and popular participation and preparing our countries to respond to this, to not just to pandemics, because pandemic is just here, tomorrow it will be another type of a disaster. So really we need to invest in the issues of public education and so on. And then the fifth one, of course, Africa doesn't have a war chest. It's so embarrassing that we are really even asking for vaccines for free. You know, our friends are there in the world, they are giving us, but what is a vaccine? $10, $5? And we're asking for these things. And we don't even have the capability on the continent to manufacture these things. We don't have resources to respond, financial, fiscal resources to respond at country level, let alone the continental level. We are asking for masks, we are asking things that we should be able to provide for ourselves. And it really, the self-reliance we're talking about, we are still a little bit far, a little bit of a distance from that. So I think the issue of the war chest that nations have and should have to enable them to respond to disasters, to emergencies, to national emergencies, it's a must. And it's something that, and this is in addition to the resources you need, to fiscal resources you need for the ongoing business of running the state. You also need resources to invest in your economy, to grow and develop your economy. Those are resources you need. But in addition to that, you need a war chest so that it is still there. And then I will say to Bio, you know, when some people find this war chest sitting there, it's not been spent, they start eating it and think that it's free money. And one day you have a national emergency, then the kitty is empty. So it's something that we really need to integrate into how fiscal planning, long-term planning, and so that our governments across the board, they build self-reliance in that, so that we don't get into the situation where we are now begging for tissues, for sanitizers, for it's really embarrassing, for masks and things that are costing not even $1. That Africa, we don't have resources at the continental level, even in most countries, to be able to provide it for these things for our own people. And then the last point really is what Bio, I think, was talking about earlier, that our studies have shown that the limitations of repressive measures, that in order for the people to comply, and you need their consent, and you can't manufacture consent through repression. You need to build, is an issue that Rose was raising, you need to build, rather manufacture. By manufacturing, I mean it in technical, scientific way, in political science, you have to manufacture trust. And that trust in the state, or that public trust in the state, should emanate from legitimacy of the state. So the more legitimate the state is, the more likely that the people will accept the measures that come from the top, but others it may not. So the issues that, so the attempt at the beginning of the state response to this pandemic to invest in repression, it had mixed results. And I think in the long term, we should rather put more investment in manufacturing trust. And then from that trust, we are able then to get a compliance, public compliance and consent. And Mr. Chairman, so really in the post-normal, we'll be going into the post-normal. For me, I think that this pandemic has really presented us with a compelling case to revisit the idea of Pan-Africanism, the way Nkrumah really advanced it at the beginning of the early 1960s and even earlier. And to say the model that of nation states, it has its own limitation, that the future of Africa is really investing in building these continent-wide capabilities and capacity across in different areas, because it has shown this pandemic that no single country, there are certain instances, certain challenges we face that no single country can on its own defeat and confront these challenges. And then, of course, the issue of the African state, its limitations, and that I have raised in different dimensions of the African state, is fiscal and all of those things. And then finally, the issue of self-reliance. I mean, that we can manufacture very basic things here. It's really embarrassing, but these are the things that Nkrumah wrote about more than 60 years ago, about building the African industrial capabilities, the R&D, and of course, and being able to pay the piper ourselves and not relying on other people to be paying the piper, because they will determine the tune. Dependency, Mr. Chairman, is one thing that has come out very strongly. Dependency at national level, dependency at the continental level. This is a clarion call, Mr. Chairman, for our continent to really, let's hope this African Diaspora Conference can assist us, but we can't go deeper into the 21st century, Mr. Chairman, without addressing these issues of dependency. We are a dependent continent. We can't even afford to get for ourselves, to manufacture for ourselves, a simple thing like a mask. So, Mr. Chairman, I think I will leave you there. I may have disappointed you and not touched on the big issues you have raised, but I'm sure I'm available. I could go into detail the studies I referred to for Sierra Leone, and also the one we did on the COVID governance and so on. They are available on our website. And I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Once again, thank you very much, Reverend, for an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Maluka. You touched on very important issues. For us to progress, we really have to change mindsets. We really have to shift the way we relate with the external world. We really have to get our act together, revisit the ideas of Pan-Africanism, use the crisis point to forge a new compact for the continent to move forward. So, without taking a lot of time to summarize your points, I want to quickly go to Professor George Kararach, and he will be touching on some of the issues that some of the speakers have already addressed, or rather gave us a teaser on. Bio talked a little bit about the state of indebtedness of the continent and what needs to be done to move away from that. And if you can build on that theme, George, and talk about the state of the sovereign debt crisis in the continent, and how do we get out of this very difficult situation, which in the first place makes us to look to the outside world for handouts. How do we rebuild our institutions? How do we reform our governance structures? What do we need to do to escape another sovereign debt crisis in the continent? Over to you.
Thank you, Mzu. So I'm coming last, and quite a number of issues have been covered. But let me start by saying that COVID has presented us with the reality of what I would describe as African vulnerabilities. And I think a lot of the other speakers have actually made reference to that. In 2020 alone, about 30 million Africans actually went into extreme poverty. We are estimating that, by we, I mean the African Development Bank, is estimating that we might have another 39 million people going into extreme poverty in 2021. In terms of growth, our economies shrunk Africa-wide, shrunk by 1.4% in 2020, but we are hoping that there will be a recovery subject to the fact that we don't have wave number 4 or 5 and so forth. And if we miss that, then we will have a rebound of about 3.4% in 2021. Now, because of COVID, there have been increased pressure on many African countries for financing. The average debt to GDP ratio has climbed significantly by between 10 to 15 percentage points across many countries because of appreciation in exchange rates, rising interest rates in some instances, and high primary balances. We know that also the debt in recent time has been shifting away from traditional sources. A lot of it now, what is accumulating across the continent is actually private and commercial debt. And that raises the issue of affordability and subsequently sustainability. Let me give just a sense. For example, Angola has about 127% of total debt to GDP ratio. That's quite significant. Mozambique, 122%. Zambia, 118% of GDP. Now those are big numbers. In the SADC region, the only countries that are actually within the SADC protocol on debt, that is with debt below 60% of GDP, Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, and Madagascar. So that kind of gives you a sense why the question of what is it that we need to do to move away from this problem of debt. And I think I would make the case that there is need for sovereign debt restructuring that fosters growth and development in Africa. The problem with previous approaches is that they have actually been ineffective. And so we need to rethink and building on equity through state instruments and to make sure that we overcome the debt spiral and chart a sustained growth path. We do know that we have, and there have been attempts in the past, of course. And right now we have the so-called debt service suspension initiative. But I would argue that this initiative is not sufficient. And the reason why that is the case is because first, it fails to facilitate early restructuring and a fair burden sharing between debtors and creditors. And secondly, it has a fragile multilateral platform for effective coordination and aggregation of resources and technical capacities. The kind of thing that Professor Malaka was talking about, you know, we need to build the capacity to manage resources and so forth. And thirdly, it does not actually elicit genuine economic governance reforms that could yield sustained growth outcomes. So it's clear that there is need to rethink this, and COVID does provide us with an opportunity to think about how we can reset our economic governance structures, and that will be critical because one of the elements that, if not referred to by all the speakers before me, is the issue of leakages that seems to pervade our societies, generally speaking. And so we need to therefore reorient the relationship between growth financing instruments, and effective governance. In the main, financing instruments should be less dependent on outsiders. I mean, again, the point that Professor Maloka was making, and tap into existing resources within the African continent. Again, that's kind of smack of Pan-Africanism, but I think it's a sentiment that has been around for many years, including the work of people like Nyerere and Nkrumah, if you want me to kind of sound historical. I'm not saying that outsiders don't have a role, but their role should be supplementary, and with that contribution realized mainly through technical support. And so what I'm saying is that the main effective instrument for overcoming that distress it should be counter-cyclical and state contingent. And so we need state contingent financing instruments, and that actually does demand that we rethink the kind of state-dependent tools and how this could be utilized. And so it also calls into question the role of African governments in terms of, for example, creating conditions for a competitive economy, in terms of setting up institutions that actually can enforce contracts, and so that people can actually do business in a transparent and above the board way. It deals with issues around corruption, for example. But it also calls around to the table international financial institutions, because they can play a very critical role in jumpstarting a contingent debt market. And in which case, they can actually create new instruments that give life to swaps or contingent loans. Also, we need to have innovative approaches that emphasize governance reforms and institutional equality, and the need to support Africa's restructuring of debt through growth. So growth should be the main lens through which the restructuring will happen. You might have heard some of the conversation in Paris last week, where President Sena of the African Development Bank actually made some proposal on what is being coined as the African Stability Mechanism. Hopefully that will take root. The thinking is that it will be probably modeled. There are some example of this kind of mechanism around the world. You have the Arab Monetary Fund, you have the European Stability Mechanism. So there are some of those, but the point is that this instrument, if it does take root, should be tailor-made and fit for purpose in Africa. Now, so what does it actually mean as we work on COVID, and how do we build back better and quicker? So I'm going to be very quick, and then I can stop. The first is that we should not forget that the health sector still remains under pressure, and therefore we should continue to support the work around the health sector and making sure that we save lives, because COVID has not gone. We might have round 2, round 3, whatever the number of waves, but we should be prepared to do that. Secondly, we must make sure that our economic policy instruments actually support economic recovery. So the use of fiscal stimuluses still remain relevant. We should try to make sure that whatever resources we put to that effort should be used prudently. And that means, for example, dealing with issues of leakages and issues of bad procurement and so forth. We also need to target inequality and poverty. Setting up social safety nets would help in that regard. Ensuring that growth is equitable would be another important element. And so and this is something that I heard somebody say, that one of the greatest equalizers has been actually COVID. It has proved that everybody can be vulnerable, and therefore issue of equality and issue of inequity need to be considered. And so the discussion earlier on the renewal of the social contract is part and parcel of that work. We also need to make sure that we protect human capital accumulation, particularly to introduce innovation in our learning systems. And this is where institutions like the Wits School of Governance, the Business School, and so on, they become relevant because universities will be at the core of rethinking how knowledge and learning loops are actually developed and entrenched, particularly in an environment now, for example, where we are adopting new learning tools, including remote learning, and the other thing that we need to think about is labor market reforms. I think the way we do or we used to work has actually been put under pressure by COVID. And so we need to think about how do we work in a new environment or the new normal. How do we tap into evolving or emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and so forth to make sure that we transit our workforce to whatever emerging sectors that might be coming into being as COVID goes into the back burner. And the point about structural transformation, I share that as well. I mean, the importance of digitization and exploiting the digital economy, e-commerce, has actually become an important element. So such innovation should be taken on board, and we need to tap into that to make sure that our economies function, even if we restrict our own movements, but we need to find new mechanisms of making sure that the economy doesn't shut down completely. And finally, and it comes back to the theme that seems to be around this discussion and into October, the issue of solidarity. I think that development cooperation need to be revisited. Certainly issues around, for example, vaccine imperialism and vaccine sovereignty and hoarding need to be dealt with. Setting up a system where Africa can anticipate disease outbreaks and pandemics, I think these are very critical points that actually, if there's anything we need to learn, is something we can learn from COVID as well. And setting our ability to be able to produce our own vaccines would be one sure way of also trying to avoid getting into a begging mode and getting into a death scenario where countries will put guns on our heads to say, all right, unless you do this or unless you sign this loan, we will not make you have access to such and such pandemic-related support mechanisms. So let me stop there and hear what others have to say on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, George. I know that you are also working on a very important, on an important manuscript on this subject. So we look forward to seeing that. I think we've had insights from different speakers. The points you highlight, George, are really very important for how the continent charts its pathway out of crises, especially to think about institutional quality, bolstering capabilities, not just in the state, but across the different dimensions of society. Now we're going to go to the chat line and see if there are any questions. We're running out of time fast, so we're going to take those questions. And depending on how many they are, we will allocate them to the different panelists as they make their closing remarks. And I would like to also invite Professor Chikane, having had all of these insights, to reflect. Maybe while we're sorting out the questions, let me hand over to him.
Yeah, I must say that I wish we had more time to have a conversation about this subject, because I found it very interesting in terms of the different speakers, the way they approach it, and the questions they've raised, and Mururu's research about, the study about the impact on civil society. And then the economy itself, and then the capacity of the state. I mean, these are issues we need to discuss quite extensively. There is also the politics of it in terms of vaccines which need to be brought in. What I would say, if we had time, Professor, it's more about the depth of impact of the virus on the economies of the countries on the African continent, and how we're going to get them to rise again to the level at which they should be. I think the indication here was that you would we might recover by 2023, 2024, but to what extent would we be able to do that, I think would be critical. And then the issues about vaccines is life. We need to deal with it now. And how are we going to succeed to do that? The last thing I want to say, I wish the repeat study that Maruru is talking about could be completed before the October conference, because that would also inform how we handle that. Yeah, I would like to stop at that.
Thanks, Prof. I saw you had, Ms. Maruru, that there's a great interest in the study that you've undertaken, and I hope you could be available in the October conference. There's only one question we have. We'll take that, and then I'll ask panelists to just take 1 minute to really to give us a way forward. Just a minute, given that we are already out of time, and maybe Ms. Maruru, you could, as part of that time allocation, answer the question on the state of digital readiness in regional economic communities like SADC. What is your observation on the ground, and then we can then move on to maybe start with Eddie to move on to Eddie to give his minute way forward, and then Bayo, and then finally George Kararaj. Please go ahead, Ms. Maruru.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, in terms of the next report, yes, it will be ready well before October. We launched the survey on June 1 for 1 month. So the data collection happens in June, and then July is the data analysis and the report writing. So we are hoping, in fact, before mid-August, we should have that new report. And I'm glad to say that we are collaborating with Wits, with CAPSI, Dr. Becky Moyo's shop. So we're working with some of the students there to help us with the data analysis. Did you want me to address the regional economic communities question? Because that's not mine. That's
your observation of the state of digital readiness on the ground, especially with civil society.
Yeah, that's a real issue, even as organizations are moving online. One of the major hurdles is connectivity. There's connectivity, just not having any, or poor connectivity. There's a problem of cost as well. Is expensive in most countries. So I think if we are really to be innovative, we are to work in different ways, we are to mitigate and cope with these sorts of crises, then the infrastructure that needs to exist is not just roads and airports, but also the digital highway. And I'm not sure, maybe like the colleague from the African Development Bank could speak to that in terms of what kinds of investments governments are making across the continent to really connect us. But it's critical.
Thanks, Ms. Maruru. I'm familiar with the study you're working on as part of CAPSI, so we're looking forward to that project, and we'll also look at what other research reports come out of that study. some that are looking at the impact on multilateral institutions in the continent, some very wonderful comparative studies looking outside of the continent, how we've responded to COVID-19. So yeah, we're looking forward to your completed paper as well as other papers in the study. George, you may want to make your 1 minute way forward, looking forward.
Mine is that I think that there's certainly a lot that needs to be done on the role of the Revs. I think certainly in terms of issues of preparedness, I think it's really critical that we have that. And also in terms of coordination in some instances, by the way, we did do some work with I believe COMESA in the work around PPEs when the COVID had just started in 2020. The bank itself put together the 10 billion COVID facility, and so regional institutions like the ADB and the likes of ECA, for example, also did a lot of work on leading the thought processes on estimating the economic cost of COVID on the African continent, including displacement in the area of work, the impact on sectors like tourism, agriculture, issues around food safety. So there's quite a range of studies. In fact, I can share with colleagues, and I think it's actually online. We did the various transmission mechanisms of the disease on the African economy. So the African Economic Outlook 2020 actually deals with the supplement in particular, in fact, which was published in June of 2020, deal with all these issues of the transmission mechanism of COVID on the continent. And as I said, we are concerned that about 9 million Africans will be in poverty this year because of COVID. So the estimates on the economy is out there. We just need to make sure that the various leakages that I described and my other colleagues actually did describe should be dealt with. Mobilizing domestic resources alone will not be sufficient. We need governance of not just our own economies, but also multilateral institutions, so that we have accountable systems that focus and prioritize people. I wouldn't use the word citizens. I've been reading Mamdani recently, so I don't want to insist on citizens. There are some people who live outside of their country, and I think these people also require a fair treatment in that regard. So let me use the word population rather than citizens, as should be our focus. Thank you.
Thank you. Eddie, you want to perhaps make your...
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. First, let me thank you for inviting me, and also to commend all the colleagues who are part of this panel and this exchange. And just to say that for me, really what my takeaway is really about how do we recast the current reforms differently now in the light of the pandemic. And that I think the reforms we have achieved quite a lot, but I think the focus has been largely on institutional performance. And you could say on the technocratic elements of institutions and just performance of institutions, competency of personnel, and so on. And I think that, and I was just taken back to when we were working on the union government. At that time, of course, it was tainted by the debate that was coming very strongly from Tripoli at that time of wanting to create a union government quite quickly. And then I was fortunate to be part of the study which was led by Professor Adedeji. And I remember one day we were then saying in the study that we proposed that let's identify the areas where we could accelerate continent-wide integration, because it's more difficult in other areas that are largely political. Let's identify, and at the time we were thinking of environment and the management of climate change issues, general disaster management, but of environmental nature, etc., etc. But I think now we have to think about the African state and the African state post this pandemic and to post the new normal, post the normal into the new normal, because this pandemic has really exposed the limitations of the African state and try to revisit that whole idea of the extent to which countries can achieve and manage certain things on their own without others. And to realize that you could say the Pan-African dimension is probably, we are probably more in need of it than we had thought. And it's beyond simply environmental coordination issues. It can even be in the governance issues. Unfortunately, even in the APRM, even with all the work that we are doing, we still work with nation states and sovereign nation states. And we do standards and codes at the continental level, pass all of this, but the nation state is still our unit of operation. So for me, I think that if we can really find a way to recast these ongoing reforms, this is what was the strength of the union government debates, that it was a discussion of Pan-Africanism and how to fast-track the creation of this union and all of those things, and to strengthen the union. We had just moved out of the OAU into the African. But now the current reforms, we're more focused on institutional performance. And I think that there's an opportunity for us as a continent. I don't know how we get to that conversation amid the APRM, but it's something that has to happen at the union level. It has to happen from Addis. And for us to think about how do we recast these current reforms beyond simply institutional performance, but looking at what should be the agenda of Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. What is it that beyond more than simply coordination of African airspace, maybe environment, what are the other issues that we can add into the pot of agenda issues really that could be handled at the continental level? I think as I said, that this pandemic has really exposed the weakness of the nation state, even in countries where we thought that the state and the governance issues were strong and well established. And clearly there are limitations, but you can see that we can perform and do better at the continental level than if we can want to do things on our own. So for me, Mr. Chairman, that's really my takeaway, and I wish you very well and all the colleagues at Wits and those who are on this panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eddie. You have a partner in Africa and Africans in diaspora in sort of mapping out the terrain ahead. And also, if I may get the cat out of the bag, you also are spearheading the African Union Research Project. So there is some critical mass that is building up to achieve exactly the things that you aspire. Bayo, if you can take a minute to offer us your own forward-looking perspectives.
Thank you very much, Chair. As Eddie spoke, I kept smiling, and I thought that there's an opportunity here for a conversation with George. Don't be afraid of the notion of citizenship, George. I know you are not afraid of it. I'm insisting on citizenship as opposed to population as the centerpiece of policy making and governance because of its politicized nature. And until we begin to politicize populations so that they simply cease to be apolitical and become more engaged, I don't think some of the things which we have spoken to today will be easy to achieve. So I would say that we have an opportunity brought out in very clear terms by the pandemic to do or redo a number of things simultaneously, many teaching opportunities with the hope that we can learn the lessons appropriately. Professor Chikane mentioned the global geopolitics. I think it's, this vaccine imperialism, if ever there was any doubt in our minds as Africans, and sometimes we tend to be too sentimental in engaging the world, that altruism doesn't exist in international affairs. The behavior of the United States and Europe over the management of the vaccines, including even in countries of Africa, where they carried out experimentation of the vaccines before manufacturing them en masse. If ever there was any doubt in our minds that Europe is for Europe and acts for Europe, the United States is not going to abandon its own people and feel sorry for Africans or help Africans to prepare to protect themselves. I hope that doubt has been erased completely, and we can begin to understand that as people who must manage our destiny and find our place, our rightful place in the world, as dignified members of the international community. Nobody can be ambitious for us. We have to be ambitious for ourselves. And we have to do so on a scale that is grand and which is Pan-African. And not, it doesn't have to be white elephant projects or daydreaming, but carefully selected strategic investments around infrastructure, both soft and hard, around issues of technology development, on issues of trade, all the spheres of development, which basically we have spent the last 60 years or so looking across the boundaries of Africa for people who will help us out, but who ultimately actually are more concerned about how to secure themselves and their people in a changing world. So my main takeaway is COVID-19, another wake-up call for Africa, and I hope that we will wake up to the challenge and use the opportunity to begin to move towards transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to really take this opportunity to thank all our participants who've taken time aside to join us in this very important conversation. We know that there are hundreds of other conversations taking place at this time today. Everyone is celebrating this day, and that's a good thing. It means that there is a sense of revival in the continent about the condition that the continent is in, and to think about the kind of futures we should desire for the continent. I'd like to thank our panelists. I think they've all been great, well prepared, really rich insights, and a blend of practitioner knowledge and scholarship, and we really are grateful to you for your time, especially because it's in the evening in other countries, and it's in the middle of the day in others. It's a working day, so we don't take your time for granted, and we hope that we can call upon you. I'd like to thank Professor Maurice Radebe and Professor Frank Chikane, who are the brainchildren behind this. Whose this idea is they are the midwives of this idea, and without them putting their heads together, this would not have taken place. And we, especially Maurice, he's been really championing this and getting both schools, the Wits Business School and the Wits School of Governance, to work together on the intellectual side of this. And I hope, Prof Chikane, you don't tire. You keep on building these initiatives. They will bear fruit eventually, and we are here to support as both schools. And we thank also the Unleashing Leadership Potential for hosting us today and for providing all the technical equipment and platform that enable us to connect together. And our teams at both schools, at marketing and events teams at both schools, Wits Business School and the Wits School of Governance. Thank you so much for your hard work. Thank you to all of you. Wishing you all the best, and we hope to see you during the October conference.